So Wyatt Smith, you've worked with Rob Marshall a few times. So I guess when he comes to you with a new project, it's a yes.
I don't want you to.
What did you think the first time he said we're going to remake? Excuse me, we're going to do a sequel to Mary Poppins?
Tilting your head down.
A little daunting, a little scary, to be honest, because it's you're talking about treading on sacred ground. I mean, it's one of the most beloved, perfect films ever made that stood the test of time over 50 years. So I'll be honest, I smiled, but was a little scared.
Well, that seems to be the general consensus. I've talked to a few people who worked on your movie, and they were all like excited, but also intimidated about having to live up to the original.
Well, yeah, so we used to say excited, but excited and scared, which was a line from Into the Woods, which we had the last film we did.
It's such a technologically complex movie. I mean, you've got animated sequences, you've got CGI sequences, you've got, of course, song and dance numbers. Right. So can you just talk a bit about how did you even start in assembling this film?
Well, barring a lot of conversations and script reading and things like that, I started on the film about a month before we started shooting. And my main goal in that month ahead of time was to look at all of the storyboards that have been done. Some numbers we had begun to previs, the stunt teams doing stunt viz, obviously choreography and dance training have been going on for months. So to start to watch all that and analyze it and look for places where, the plan seems sound, but maybe the story gets a little lost. It's one of my biggest issues, certainly with the previs world, is often it's like music videos and you don't, I'm like, but where are the close-ups? Where's the, where are all the things that are going to make this connect as a story to people? So spent that first month there, and then of course start cutting the moment we start shooting. And I keep my distance from set unless I'm wanted there. Sometimes Rob wants me there while we're shooting, and certainly anything I have questions or wondering if we need some little extra elements, then I'm going to go to Rob for that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the previs. I mean, just talk a little bit about that. For people who don't understand, I mean, you are literally, before they shoot, you are figuring out how you're going to put together these really complicated sequences.
Right. Well, I guess I'll talk about previs a little more generally, because there wasn't a ton of it on this film needed. The nice thing about Rob is he does so much organically. Like even in Nowhere to Go But Up at the end of the film, when people are lifting off the ground, they were actually lifting off the ground. There's only a certain point where it becomes green screens of them in the air. But previs is like a video game. It's a roadmap. And what it does is it teaches you lots of things. One, you can visualize a very complicated sequence, so then the visual effects team can figure out who's the best vendor to work on that, or how many vendors they'll need. It gives you a rough idea of how many shots they're going to be and how complex they are in terms of what they're going to cost, things the visual effects producer will be breaking down. But also, it gives you methodology, because in a lot of cases, there's things like, well, how do you get the camera to wrap around? What lenses should we be using? What types of harnesses? Can they move this way if we want to create this type of shot? And then you're able to really break down how to even go about filming it. So there was certainly a decent amount of that, certainly for the balloon number at the end of the film and the underwater sequence of how exactly do we do it. And the previs helps.
Right. You've done, this is the third musical that you've done with Rob Marshall, 9 and Into the Woods before
and
that.
This and before 9, I did a Tony Bennett special for NBC, right, which is how we met.
So you are familiar with the rhythms of how he likes to put together song and dance numbers. Explain a little bit about what your guys' approach is to presenting these musical numbers.
The approach was into the musical numbers. Well, not quite sure how you mean there.
I guess in the sense of, I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of energy to the way that he presents musical numbers. I mean, as a dancer himself, you get both the full body expression of the dance numbers, but also there are those very specific moments where he cuts in closer to get, a reaction shot off of Lin-Manuel Miranda, for instance.
Well, I mean, the good thing is it's great to have a shorthand with Rob, because we have had some multiple projects together, as well as his team, production design, all of the cinematographer, and it by no means makes it easier, but it helps to know what his rhythms and his tastes are like. But the most important thing is, over the years, I am not a dancer. It's incredibly apparent if you've ever seen me. But learning to watch that performance through a dancer's eyes, because Rob sees attention to detail in a frame. I mean, it's unbelievable how quick he is to just be like, no. In terms of the steps. So it's learning to see that, to protect our actors so that they are, they spend a lot of time learning this, and we want them to be the strongest dancers possible. But also making sure that the whole spectacle of a dance number doesn't get overridden by the fact that there is your songs are your scenes. Your song should never be saying something that you've already covered as dialogue in a scene. So it's important, when you do have all this spectacle, that if there's a meaningful line being said there, that you're on it and you're ready for it, and you're going to take it in, and it's not just going to flash by, in some kind of slick way. You got to make sure the story always stays there and the performance always stays there.
Right. One of the wonderful ways that this movie calls back to the original is in that animated sequence when they go into the China Bowl. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about putting that together.
Yes, the animated sequence, that was obviously a very new experience. There was a time in my life where I wanted to be an animator, and there's certain details to it that I knew, but I've never had the experience of working with an animation team. Parts of it were very familiar in terms of we had a storyboard, and it's cutting a musical number, and everything's green screen, and you have proxies representing, a dog coachman and a horse and all of that. And then we would pre-record actors to get the performance for the voices of all who would eventually be animated characters. There was a bit of a familiarity to that, but the thing that was completely new was what the performance of those animated characters was going to be. Because as we talked a bit about previs, traditionally, if I was working on a sequence like that, I would put backgrounds in, so you can see what the backgrounds look like. Or maybe if I have a post-viz team, I might put, a horse in just so we can see the horse. But the thing is in the world of hand-drawn animation, anything you represent on the screen that is not the animator's drawing steals from their performance that they're going to do. It steals from their creativity. It tells them, it forces them into something. So it was really complicated to create that sequence using our imagination for what it was all going to be, and then having to wait months before we'd even start to see the very first drawings back to represent these characters and what their personalities would be. Would they be ridiculously broad? Would they be too intense? I mean, we spend so much time looking for the nuances in performances of every take of every actor, and suddenly there are these artists drawing these characters based on what they're hearing, based on this kind of cut we've created, and wondering how that was going to work. Thankfully, they're brilliant at what they do. They're genius, beautiful artists. And I mean, it was thrilling to see Seamus, the coachman, for the first time. One of the first shots we got was when he turns around and says, "Oh, Mary Poppins, is it yourself?" And it was just like, it's so exciting. And then I knew we were going to be great. Getting the penguins to be great dancers that maybe weren't upstaging Mary, that took a little bit of time. There was definitely some crumpled papers and some new drawings after that one. But it's incredible how all those worlds merged and everything I learned from that animation process.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes you ask people, I never ask this of an editor because they're the ones who see it cut together for the first time, but it must be really something to see something like that and realize, oh, that's the movie that I'm making.
Right. I mean, there's many stages to it. You see very rough little pencil sketches that don't even represent every frame, but yeah, it's incredible to see that kind of something from nothing, where it's such an organic process.
Having worked with Rob Marshall this many times, I mean, you mentioned knowing his rhythms. I mean, how has that relationship grown over these last few movies?
There's a lot more comfort. It's also there's things that take time to, like, one of the key things to understand with Rob is he is so focused. He has very, very, very strong vision, and way before he's, the script is even fully fleshed out, I know that he's closed his eyes and he has watched this movie cut for cut, note for note in his head. And it doesn't mean that it's got to be strictly that and this is what we're doing and push that button, but it's very important to get what's in his head on the screen. And I want to do that as quickly as possible, because then we can do the work where it's like, oh, but that doesn't work, or this could be better, and all this, and to create that dialogue. So what's nice is after all this time, the kind of baby steps of getting that process are gone. And also the ways that we're able to talk to each other while he's shooting. And I can see his intentions so much more clearly in the footage now that we've done it several times. So I'm able to, at least in those first cuts, get him so much closer to his vision, and it's just experience of collaborating.
Was there a sequence in the movie? I mean, we've talked about a lot of technically adventurous scenes that you had to cut together, but I mean, the movie has a really wonderful and delicate tone. I mean, it's just got the right amount of realism and danger and drama to make you feel compassion for these characters while also enjoying the movie. Was there a sequence that was difficult for you to cut from an emotional standpoint?
Absolutely. The interesting thing is you would immediately say the ballad, the place where lost things go. That was a relief to cut. The challenge was cutting the scene that leads into it, which is when the kids tumble out of the animated world, which was essentially this nightmare, and the realization that they're going to lose their home. And that's finally when the kids are broken. That's when Georgie finally says what hasn't been said, which is, I miss Mother. Doesn't matter that Mary's there. There is a huge void in their lives and they're scared, and it all becomes very real for them in that moment. That scene, Georgie waking up in bed, that was very difficult to cut. It's also, you've just come out of this massive 15-minute, just huge excitement that ends in this massive chase, and suddenly you're in a pin drop with these kids, waking up from a nightmare in bed. Very difficult to get the performances and the tone of that, even though it's only maybe a minute and a half before Mary then comforts them with the lullaby. But getting that right was very, very hard because of what you're saying. I mean, this movie is mostly told through the children's perspective. And if we're not representing them properly, it'll hurt the whole film after it. It's a big turning point.
How do you, is it just a bunch of trial and error and looking at things over and over again until you finally get it, or?
Yes. Trial and error as much as it is, we know that there's many, many ways to do it. Mm-hmm. So we just want to make sure we exhaust every possible option there, every form of pace for that beat. Playing different moments on each person, just really trying to find what connects the most. Because it's not just Georgie. Georgie's the one who's saying what we need to hear. But it's how John and Annabelle, where Mary is in that scene. It seems like such a simple little moment, but also knowing that each time you want to see if it works, you have to watch the whole chase leading into it and then watch the lullaby after it to see if the arc of it feels right.
Yeah, I had a film editing teacher in college who said, you always hear this when you walk by an editor's suite, the same scene over and over and over again, and then you'll hear it with a slight variation just after a few times.
Thankfully, Rob is he's very hands-on in the editing process. He's with me all day, every day. He knows that it's his time to shape this film, and he's very patient of that. And I also try to work very quickly for him.
Well, it's a wonderful movie. Wyatt, thank you so much. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks
Have a good one.
Take care.